Elizabeth Thornton stood at the window of her luxurious office on the top floor of a skyscraper in downtown New York City. At the age of 55, she had achieved everything she could have ever dreamed of: a successful business, a huge fortune, a beautiful mansion in the country. But why did she feel so empty inside? She slowly moved away from the window and sat down at her massive oak desk. In front of her was the financial report for the last quarter. The numbers were impressive, but they no longer brought her joy. "Mrs. Thornton, your husband is on the line." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Thank you, Margot. Put him through." "Elizabeth." Richard's voice sounded cold and formal as always. "I just wanted to remind you that we have an important dinner with investors tonight. Don't be late." "Of course, Richard," she replied. "I'll be on time." "One more thing," he added. "Your new Chanel dress has arrived. I had Grace prepare it for you." Elizabeth felt irritation seize her. "I didn't ask you to buy me a new dress, Richard. I have enough clothes." "Elizabeth," he sounded impatient. "We talked about this. You must look perfect. It's important for our image." She closed her eyes, trying to hold back her anger. "Okay, Richard, I will wear this dress." "Great," he said. "See you tonight." The line went dead and Elizabeth leaned back. When had their marriage become such a cold business contract? She couldn't remember the last time Richard had spoken to her about anything other than work and social events. Elizabeth went to the bar in the corner of her office and poured herself a glass of whiskey. She rarely drank during the day, but today she felt she needed it. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, turning to her desk. Margot, her personal assistant for over a decade, entered the office. "Mrs. Thornton," she began hesitantly, "I know you don't like to be bothered with personal matters, but—" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "It's about your daughter, Emma," Margot said. "She called several times while you were in the meeting. She seems to be in some kind of trouble at college." Elizabeth felt her heart clench. Emma, her only child, was everything to her. But lately, they hadn't talked much. "What exactly did she say?" Elizabeth asked, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Margot looked uncomfortable. "She didn't go into details, Mrs. Thornton, but she sounded very upset. She said she needed to talk to you in person." Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt wash over her. When was the last time she had actually talked to her daughter? Not just exchanging short messages or making quick calls between meetings, but actually listening to her. "Thank you, Margot," she said quietly. "I'll call her right now." When the assistant left, Elizabeth picked up the phone and dialed her daughter's number. After a few rings, Emma's voice came through. "Mom? You finally called back." Elizabeth could hear the pain in her daughter's voice. "Emma, dear, what's wrong? Margot said you were in some kind of trouble." "Oh, Mom," Emma sounded like she was about to cry. "I don't know what to do. I think I want to drop out of college." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. "What? But why? You've always wanted to study law." "I thought that's what I wanted," Emma said. "But now, I'm not sure. I feel like I'm just following the path that you and Dad have chosen for me. I don't know who I really am or what I want out of life." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling her own doubts and frustrations reflected in her daughter's words. "Emma, honey, Mom," Emma interrupted. "I know you're busy. Can we meet? I really need to talk to you in person." Elizabeth looked at her watch. There were a few hours left before the dinner with the investors. Richard would be furious if she canceled or was late. But then she thought about the emptiness she felt, the coldness of her marriage, how far she had drifted away from her own daughter. "Of course, dear," she said, making her decision. "I will come to you right now. We'll talk about everything that's bothering you." "Really?" Emma sounded surprised and hopeful. "What about your work?" Elizabeth smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that she was doing something right. "I have nothing more important than you, Emma. I'll be there in an hour." As she hung up the phone, Elizabeth felt herself become determined. Maybe it was time to reassess her priorities and realize what was really important in life. She took her bag and walked out of the office, leaving a surprised Margot at her desk. "Cancel all my meetings for today, Margot, and call Mr. Thornton. Tell him I can't make the investor dinner. I have an important family matter." As the elevator doors closed behind her, Elizabeth felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know where this conversation with her daughter would lead, but she was sure of one thing: something in her life had to change, and those changes were starting right now. Elizabeth was sitting in her favorite chair in the library of the mansion, looking out at the garden through the huge window. The conversation with Emma last night had made her rethink many things in her life. She realized how far she had strayed from the person she once was and from the people she cared about most. The library door opened and Richard walked in. His face was tense and his eyes were irritated. "Elizabeth," he began sternly, "I hope you have a good reason for missing last night's dinner. Do you realize how important it was to our business?" Elizabeth slowly turned to him. "Our daughter is more important than any business, Richard." He rolled his eyes. "There's that sentimentality again. Emma is 21 years old. She's a grown woman and should be able to solve her own problems." "You didn't even ask what happened," Elizabeth said quietly. Richard sighed. "Okay, so what happened?" "She wants to drop out of college," Elizabeth replied. "She feels like she's going the wrong way." "What nonsense!" Richard exploded. "We've invested so much money in her education, and now she wants to quit? No, that's not going to happen. I will talk to her and explain how ridiculous this is." Elizabeth felt herself getting angry. "You won't talk to anyone, Richard. You won't even listen. Our daughter is miserable, and all you care about is money and image." Richard looked at her in surprise. "When did you start caring about anything else, Elizabeth? Didn't you always say that success was the most important thing? Didn't you spend days and nights in the office building your empire?" These words hit Elizabeth like a slap in the face. She suddenly saw herself through the eyes of others, a cold, ambitious woman who put her career above all else. "Maybe I was wrong," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to make a change." Richard laughed. "And what are you going to do? Give up everything and become a housewife?" Elizabeth stood up and walked over to him. "No, Richard, but I want to understand what is happening in my life. I want to find myself again." "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, looking at her like she was crazy. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I decided to leave for a while. To Europe. Maybe to France or Italy. I need time to think things over and figure out what I really want from life." Richard looked surprised. "Are you serious? What about the company? What about our commitments?" "You'll do just fine without me, Richard," Elizabeth said. "This will be a good test for you. Show me that you can run things on your own." Richard thought for a moment. "And how long do you plan to be gone?" "A month, maybe 2, Elizabeth replied. "I'll let you know when I know for sure." Richard sighed. "Okay, if that's what you really want. But don't forget your responsibilities, Elizabeth. We have a business that needs your attention." Elizabeth nodded. "I know, Richard, and I promise I'll come back with new energy and ideas." After Richard left, Elizabeth picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Penny? It's Elizabeth. I need your help." An hour later, Penny Grant, Elizabeth's longtime friend and talented stylist, entered the library. Elizabeth briefly explained her plan, not going into details about the nanny job. "Are you sure about this, Liz?" Penny asked. "It could be dangerous. What if someone finds out?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No one will find out. You're going to help me become a different person. A new look, a new personality. I'll be Beth Thompson, a 28-year-old woman from Ohio looking for work in New York." Penny sighed. "Okay, if you're sure. Let's start with your hair." The next few hours were spent in transformation. Elizabeth watched her long brown hair fall to the floor, replaced by a short blonde bob. Penny worked on her makeup, making it more natural and youthful. She also brought clothes, simple jeans, t-shirts, comfortable sneakers, all the things that Elizabeth Thornton had never had in her wardrobe. When everything was ready, Elizabeth looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. There stood a young woman with bright blue eyes and freckles on her nose. She looked fresh, young, and normal. "You look amazing," Penny said. "But what about the documents? You'll need to show your ID when you apply for a job." Elizabeth smiled. "Don't worry, I've got it all figured out. I have a friend who can help with that. It will be a temporary ID, but it will be enough for work." Penny shook her head. "I still think it's crazy, Liz, but if it's what you really want, it's what I need," Elizabeth said firmly. "I need to understand what's going on in my life, and maybe I can be a better mother to Emma." Penny hugged her friend. "Take care of yourself, okay? And if you need anything, just call me." Elizabeth nodded. "Thanks, Penny. You are a true friend." The next day, when Richard was at the office, Elizabeth packed a small suitcase and left a note saying she was leaving for Paris. In reality, she went to a small hotel in another part of the city. From there, as Beth Thompson, she applied for a job as a nanny at her own estate. She knew that their current nanny had recently quit and was confident that she could get the job. Standing in front of the gate of her own estate with a small suitcase in hand, Elizabeth, now Beth Thompson, took a deep breath as she prepared to play the role of her life. "This is the beginning of something new," she thought as she pressed the bell, "and I don't know where it will lead, but I'm ready to find out the truth, whatever it is." The gate opened, and Beth Thompson entered a new world, a world she had created but never truly known. Beth Thompson stood in front of the massive oak doors of Thornton Manor, feeling her heart beat faster. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "You can do this," she thought. "You're Beth Thompson, a 28-year-old woman from Ohio looking for a job in New York. You are not Elizabeth Thornton." The door opened and George, the butler she had known for years, stood before her. Beth held her breath, expecting him to recognize her despite the change in appearance. "Good afternoon," George said in a formal tone. "How can I help you?" Beth felt relieved and strangely disappointed at the same time. He didn't recognize her. "Good afternoon," she replied, trying to speak with a slight Midwestern accent. "I'm Beth Thompson. I'm here for an interview for the nanny position." George nodded. "Oh yes, Miss Thompson, please come in. Mrs. Hudson is waiting for you in the living room." Beth walked into the house she knew like the back of her hand, but now she was looking at it with new eyes. She noticed things she had never noticed before: a small crack in the ceiling, the slight smell of furniture polish, the soft hum of the air conditioner. Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, was sitting in the living room. She was a middle-aged woman with a stern face and a piercing gaze. "Sit down, Miss Thompson," she said, pointing to the chair across from her. Beth sat down, feeling strangely uncomfortable in the chair she had chosen several years ago. "So," Mrs. Hudson began, looking at the papers in front of her, "you're looking for a nanny job. Do you have any experience with children?" Beth hesitated for a moment. She knew she had no real experience, but she had a story ready. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "I was a nanny for a family in Ohio for 2 years. I took care of 2 children, ages 5 and 7. Mrs. Hudson raised an eyebrow. "And why did you leave that job?" "My family moved to California," Beth quickly replied. "And I always wanted to live in New York, so I decided to try my luck here." Mrs. Hudson nodded. "I see." "I graduated from college with a degree in education," Beth said, recalling her prepared legend. "I've always loved working with children." "Good," said Mrs. Hudson. "Now let's talk about your responsibilities. You will be responsible for 2 children, Olivia, who is 8 years old, and Max, who is 5. You will be responsible for helping them with their homework, cooking for them, taking them to after-school activities, and generally keeping them comfortable and safe." Beth nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt wash over her. She rarely spent time with her children, always too busy working. Now she had a chance to see them from a different perspective. "I understand," she said. "I love my children and I would love to take care of them." Mrs. Hudson continued, "You will live here in the mansion. You will have your own room on the third floor, next to the children's rooms. Your days off are Saturday and Sunday, unless there are special circumstances. The salary." Beth listened to Mrs. Hudson describe the working conditions she had once set for herself. She was shocked to realize how little freedom and personal time the nanny had. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Hudson said, looking Beth straight in the eye. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton are very busy people. They are rarely home and expect you to be fully responsible for the children in their absence. Are you ready for this responsibility?" Beth felt her heart sink. "Yes, I understand," she replied quietly. "I will do everything I can to keep the children happy and safe." Mrs. Hudson nodded. "Good. Do you have any questions?" Beth shook her head. "No, I think everything is clear." "Good," Mrs. Hudson said as she stood up. "Then let me show you to your room. You can start work tomorrow." Beth followed Mrs. Hudson upstairs, trying to look like she was seeing the house for the first time. They passed her bedroom, Elizabeth Thornton's bedroom, and Beth felt a strange sense of alienation. Her new room was small but clean and cozy. It was much simpler than Elizabeth's luxurious bedroom, but Beth felt she liked it better here. "Make yourself comfortable," Mrs. Hudson said. "Dinner is at 7 in the staff kitchen. Don't be late." When Mrs. Hudson left, Beth sat down on her bed and took a deep breath. She had made it. She was here, in her own home, but as a completely different person. Suddenly she heard children laughing from the hallway. Her heart sank. It was her children. She went to the door and opened it cautiously. Olivia and Max were running down the hall playing a game. They stopped when they saw her. "Hi," Olivia said, looking at her curiously. "Are you the new nanny?" Beth felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back. "Yes," she answered with a smile. "My name is Beth, and you must be Olivia and Max." The children nodded. "Will you play with us?" Max asked, his voice hopeful. Beth felt her heart break. How many times had she heard this question from her children and turned them down because she was too busy? "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "I would love to play with you. What do you play?" "Pirates!" Max exclaimed. "I am the captain, and Olivia is my first mate. You can be a sea monster." Beth laughed, feeling her heart fill with warmth. "I would love to be a sea monster." She spent the next half hour chasing the children down the hallway, making scary noises and trying to eat them. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had so much fun. When it was time for dinner, the children reluctantly said goodbye to her. "Will you play with us again tomorrow?" Olivia asked. "I will," Beth promised. She went down to the staff kitchen, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was happy to have spent time with her children, but at the same time she felt deeply sad to realize how much she had missed. The other staff had already gathered in the kitchen. Beth nervously sat down at the table, feeling like a stranger among people she had known for years. "Hi, new girl," said a young maid sitting down next to her. "I'm Lucy. Don't worry, you'll settle in quickly." Beth smiled at her. "Thank you. I'm Beth." She looked around, listening to the staff talking. They were discussing their day, joking and laughing. Beth suddenly realized that she had never thought about what kind of life these people led outside of their jobs. "Yes, the new nanny," said the gardener, Tom. "How do you like our little devils?" Beth smiled. "They seem like great kids." Tom hummed. "Wait until you see them in a bad mood, especially when their parents cancel plans to spend time with them again." Beth felt her heart clench. "Where are Mr. and Mrs. Thornton now?" she asked cautiously. Lucy rolled her eyes. "Oh, Mrs. Thornton went to Europe. Probably back to some fashion show or something. And Mr. Thornton is at work as usual. I doubt you'll see them much." Beth nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt wash over her. She had never thought about how her constant absence was affecting the children and how she was perceived by the staff. After dinner, Beth returned to her small room. She sat down on the bed and took out the photo of Emma that she had secretly brought with her. Looking at her eldest daughter's smiling face, Beth felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "What have I done?" she thought. "How could I have been so blind?" But she knew that now she had a chance to make things right, a chance to understand her children, her home, and the people who work for her, a chance to become a better mother, a better person. With that thought in mind, Beth went to bed preparing for her first full day as a nanny in her own home. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was ready to face it with an open heart and open eyes. Beth woke up to the sound of her alarm clock at 6 in the morning. For a moment, she forgot where she was and reached for her nightstand, expecting to find her usual phone. Instead, her hand met emptiness, and the reality of her new life suddenly hit her. She quickly got up, dressed in the simple clothes that now made up her wardrobe, and hurried downstairs to the kitchen. Mrs. Hudson was already there, preparing breakfast for the children. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," the housekeeper said in a stern tone. "I hope you slept well. We have a long day ahead of us." Beth nodded. "Good morning, Mrs. Hudson. What can I do for you?" "You can set the table for the children. They'll be up soon. Olivia likes her toast with peanut butter, and Max only eats cereal with milk. And don't forget their vitamins." Beth set to work trying to remember where everything was in the kitchen. She could feel Mrs. Hudson's eyes on her and tried not to show her ignorance. When the children came downstairs for breakfast, Beth felt her heart fill with warmth. They looked so small and vulnerable in their pajamas. "Good morning, Olivia, Max," she said with a smile. "How did you sleep?" Olivia yawned. "I was fine. Are you really going to be our new nanny?" Beth nodded. "Yes, I am. I hope we get along well." Max suddenly frowned. "Where's my mom? She promised to come to my kindergarten recital today." Beth felt her heart clench. She had completely forgotten about the performance. "Your mom? She really wanted to come, but she had something important to do," Beth said, feeling the lie catch in her throat. "But I'm definitely coming to see you perform, okay?" Max nodded, but his face still showed disappointment. Beth felt a pang of guilt wash over her. How many times had she let her children down because of important things? After breakfast, Beth helped her children get dressed and ready for school. She was surprised to realize that she didn't know what things her children liked, what their favorite toys were. After the driver dropped the children off at school, Beth returned to the house feeling emotionally drained. But the day was just beginning. "Miss Thompson," Mrs. Hudson called out to her, "you have a list of things to do today. You need to wash the children's laundry, clean their rooms, make lunch for when they get home from school, and then take Olivia to her ballet class and Max to soccer practice." Beth nodded, feeling panic grip her. She had never done anything like this on her own. There was always staff to take care of these things. She started with the laundry, trying to figure out the washing machine she had never used before. After several failed attempts, she finally understood how it worked. Cleaning her rooms proved to be even more challenging. Beth had never thought about how much work goes into keeping a clean house. She spent an hour trying to tidy up the children's rooms and still felt that the result was far from perfect. When it came time to prepare lunch, Beth realized that she had no idea what her children liked to eat. She decided to make pasta and cheese, hoping it would be a safe choice. The children returned from school and Beth was relieved to see them. But her joy quickly gave way to anxiety when Olivia looked at the pasta and grimaced. "I don't like pasta with cheese. My mom always makes me chicken salad." Beth felt her face turn red. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Maybe I can make you something else." Olivia sighed. "No, it's okay. I'm just not really hungry. After lunch, it was time to take the children to their classes. Beth had never driven a car in New York before and felt completely lost in the chaotic traffic of the city. She got lost several times and the kids started to get nervous. "We're going to be late," Olivia complained. "Madame Giselle will be very unhappy." Beth could feel the sweat running down her back. "I'm sorry, children. I just don't know the city very well." When they finally got to the ballet studio, Olivia was already 15 minutes late. Her teacher, a stern woman with graying hair, greeted them with a displeased look. "Miss Thornton always brings Olivia on time," she said coldly. "I hope it won't become a habit." Beth felt her cheeks burn with shame. "It won't happen again, I promise." After she left Olivia at the ballet studio, Beth hurried to take Max to soccer practice. But when they arrived at the field, it turned out that she had forgotten his uniform at home. "But they won't let me play without my uniform," Max cried. Beth felt panic grip her. "Oh, Max, I'm so sorry. Can we go home quickly and get it?" But it was too late. Practice had started and Max was forced to sit on the bench watching his friends play without him. When they returned home, both children were upset and irritated. Beth felt completely exhausted and defeated. "You are the worst nanny in the world," Max exclaimed, running out of the car. "I want my mom to come back." These words hit Beth right in the heart. She watched her children run into the house feeling tears well up in her eyes. Mrs. Hudson met her in the hallway, her face expressing displeasure. "Miss Thompson, I hope you will do better tomorrow. The children should not suffer because of your incompetence." Beth nodded, unable to say a word. She went up to her small room and fell on her bed, finally letting her tears flow. She had never realized how hard her job as a nanny was. She had never thought about all the little things that needed to be remembered, all the tasks that needed to be done. And worst of all, she never realized how important her presence was to her children. Lying in the dark, Beth thought about how many times she had missed important moments in her children's lives because of work, how many times she had left them in the care of nannies, thinking that was enough. "I've been a terrible mother," she thought, feeling her heart break at the realization. But then she remembered the smiles on her children's faces as she played with them yesterday. She remembered how Max had hugged her before he left for school this morning. "Maybe it's not too late to make things right," she thought. "Maybe I can still learn to be a good mother." A week has passed since Beth started working as a nanny in her own home. Every day brought new challenges, but she was gradually learning to cope with them. She already knew that Olivia loved to have her hair braided before bedtime, and Max couldn't fall asleep without his favorite stuffed animal, a lion named Rory. This morning, Beth woke up earlier than usual. She quietly went down to the kitchen, hoping to prepare a special breakfast for the children. As she passed Richard's office, she heard muffled voices. It seemed strange. Richard didn't usually come home this early. Beth froze at the door, listening. "Richard, you can't go on like this," she heard a woman's voice say. It wasn't her own voice, and Beth felt her heart sink. "Hush, Melanie," Richard replied. "Someone might hear." "I don't care," said the woman named Melanie. "I can't hide it anymore. You promised you would divorce her." Beth felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She leaned against the wall, trying to keep her balance. "I know I promised," Richard said in a tired voice. "But it's not that simple. Elizabeth is not just my wife, she is my business partner. If we divorce, it could destroy everything we've built." "What about us?" Melanie asked. "We've been together for 2 years, Richard. How much longer do I have to wait?" Beth felt her eyes fill with tears. 2 years. Her husband had been cheating on her for 2 years, and she hadn't even noticed. "Just give me a little more time," Richard said. "I'll fix it, I promise." Beth heard them approaching the door and quickly moved away, hiding behind a column in the hall. She saw a young woman with long blonde hair, one of the new secretaries in the office, come out of her office. Richard followed her out, looking tired and confused. When they left, Beth slowly sank to the floor, feeling her world falling apart. She sat there for a long time trying to process what she had heard. "Miss Thompson," came Mrs. Hudson's voice. "What are you doing here?" Beth quickly wiped away her tears and stood up. "I was just a little dizzy. I'm fine now." Mrs. Hudson looked at her suspiciously but said nothing. The day passed in a blur. Beth went about her duties mechanically, trying not to think about what she had heard that morning. But in the evening, when the children went to bed, she could not hold back any longer. She sat in her small room, looking at a photo of her happy family, a photo she had secretly taken with her. In it, she and Richard were smiling, holding little Olivia and Max. They looked so happy, so perfect. But now Beth knew it was just an illusion. Suddenly she heard a knock at the door. "Miss Thompson?" It was Lucy, the young maid. "Are you awake?" Beth quickly wiped away her tears. "No, Lucy, come in." Lucy came in holding a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this. You looked upset today." Beth smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Lucy. That's very kind of you." Lucy sat down next to her on the bed. "Do you want to talk about it?" Beth hesitated. She couldn't tell the truth, but she really needed to talk to someone. "I just found out that my boyfriend is cheating on me," she finally said. Lucy sighed. "Oh, Miss Thompson, I'm so sorry. Men can be such jerks." Beth nodded, feeling new tears welling up in her eyes. "I just don't understand how he could do this. I thought we were happy." Lucy put her hand on her shoulder. "You know, sometimes people don't appreciate what they have until they lose it. Maybe it's his loss, not yours." Beth looked at her gratefully. "Thank you, Lucy. You are very kind." They sat there for a while, talking about everything and nothing. Beth felt the weight on her heart lighten a little. She had never spoken like this with one of her staff before, and now she realized how much she had missed out on because of her aloofness. The next day, as Beth was walking the children to school, she noticed that Olivia looked upset. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she asked, sitting down next to the girl. Olivia looked at her with tears in her eyes. "I heard my dad yelling at my mom on the phone last night. He said that she had to come home because he couldn't handle everything by himself anymore." Beth felt her heart clench. She hugged Olivia. "Oh, honey, sometimes adults fight, but that doesn't mean they don't love each other or you." "But Mommy's been gone so long," Olivia said. "I miss her so much." Beth felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I know, sweetie, but I'm sure your mom loves you very much and will be back soon." She hugged Olivia tighter, feeling her own heart breaking with pain and guilt. That night, after the children fell asleep, Beth sat in her room trying to figure out what to do next. She knew she couldn't just go back to her old life, pretending nothing had happened. But she also couldn't just drop everything and leave. Suddenly she heard a noise coming from Richard's office. She quietly went to the door and listened. "No, you don't understand," Richard was saying to someone on the phone. "We are on the verge of bankruptcy. If we don't get this contract, everything is gone." Beth felt her heart sink. Bankruptcy? How was that possible? She had always thought their business was booming. "I can't tell Elizabeth," Richard continued. "She'd kill me if she knew I'd invested all our money in this risky project." Beth felt anger rising in her. How could he make such a decision without her knowledge? How could he jeopardize everything they had built together? She stepped away from the door, feeling her head spinning from all this information. Her husband was cheating on her, their business was on the verge of collapse, and her children were suffering in her absence. Beth sat on the edge of the bed, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought she knew everything about her life, her family, her business. But now she realized that she was blind to what was happening right in front of her eyes. She was looking at her reflection in a small mirror on the wall. The woman looking back at her looked tired and confused, but there was determination in her eyes. I have to fix this, Beth thought. For the sake of my children, for the sake of myself, I have to make it right. She didn't know exactly how she was going to do that, but she knew one thing. She could no longer be a bystander in her own life. It was time to act, time to change what had gone wrong. With this thought in mind, Beth went to bed preparing for the new challenges that awaited her tomorrow. She knew the road would be hard, but she was ready to fight for her family, for her business, for her life. Beth woke up at first light, feeling the weight of yesterday's discoveries. She knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for her life to fall apart. She needed to act, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies. When Beth went down to the kitchen earlier than usual, she met Martha, an elderly cook who had been working at the estate for over 20 years. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," Martha greeted her as she stirred something in a large pot. "You're early today." Beth nodded. "Good morning, Martha. Yes, I couldn't sleep." Martha looked at her carefully. "Is something bothering you, child?" Beth hesitated. She couldn't reveal her true identity, but she needed someone to talk to. "Martha," she began carefully, "you've been working in this house for a long time. Is this family happy?" Martha stopped, putting her spoon down on the table. "Oh, child, that's a difficult question. You know, I've seen these children grow up. I have seen the ups and downs of this family, and I can tell you one thing. It's not all gold that glitters." Beth felt her heart clench. "What do you mean?" Martha sighed. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, they're good people, but they've gotten lost in their success. They've forgotten what's really important." Beth nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "And the children, do you think they suffer because of this?" "Children always suffer when their parents forget about them," Martha said quietly. "But you know what? I see how much you care about them. You're making a difference, Miss Thompson." Beth smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Martha. It means a lot to me." Throughout the day, Beth watched the other staff members closely, trying to figure out who she could trust. She noticed how George, the butler, was always especially attentive to the children, often bringing them small gifts or sweets. In the evening, when the children were asleep, Beth met George in the hallway. "George," she said to him, "can I talk to you?" The butler nodded. "Of course, Miss Thompson. What is troubling you?" Beth took a deep breath. "I've noticed that you are very kind to the children. How long have you been working for this family?" "Almost 30 years, George answered with a slight smile. "I saw Miss Elizabeth born, and now I see her children growing up." "And do you think," Beth asked cautiously, "that they are happy? The children, I mean." George thought for a moment. "They're good kids, smart, kind, but they lack the attention of their parents, especially now that Mrs. Elizabeth has left." Beth felt a pang of guilt. "And you don't know why she left?" George shook his head. "I'm afraid not, but I hope she'll be back soon. The children need her." Beth nodded, feeling her resolve grow. "Thank you, George. I'll try to do my best for the kids while she's away." The next day, Beth decided to talk to Lucy, the young maid who was always friendly and helpful. "Lucy," she said to the girl as they cleaned the children's rooms together, "how long have you been working here?" "A little over a year," Lucy replied. "Why?" Beth hesitated. I've noticed some strange things about this house. For example, Mr. Thornton seems very tense lately." Lucy glanced around as if to see if anyone was listening and lowered her voice. "You mustn't tell anyone this, but I heard him on the phone last week. I think the company is in some kind of trouble." Beth felt her heart speed up. "What kind of problems?" "I'm not sure," Lucy said, "but it sounded like something serious. He was talking about some debts and that he needed to find an investor urgently." Beth nodded, feeling the pieces of the puzzle start to come together. "Thank you, Lucy. That's very important information." Over the next few days, Beth continued to observe and talk to the staff, gradually gathering information about what was going on in the house and in the company. She learned that Richard often came home late and in a bad mood, that he had started drinking more than usual. One evening, as Beth was sitting in her room thinking about all that she had learned, she heard a soft knock on the door. "Miss Thompson." It was Mrs. Hudson. "May I come in?" Beth was surprised. The housekeeper rarely came to her room. Yes, of course. Mrs. Hudson came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "Miss Thompson, I have noticed that you have been asking a lot of questions about the Thornton family lately." Beth felt her heart sink. "I just want to understand the situation better so I can take better care of the children." Mrs. Hudson looked at her for a long time as if assessing her. "You know, I've been working in this house for many years, and I have seen this family change. They used to be happy, really happy. But then money and success became more important than anything else." Beth felt her eyes fill with tears. "And now? What's happening now?" Mrs. Hudson sighed. "Everything is falling apart now. Mr. Thornton made some risky investments, and now the company is on the verge of bankruptcy. And Mrs. Elizabeth, she just ran away from the problems." Beth felt a pang of guilt, but she continued to listen. "But you know what?" Mrs. Hudson continued. "I see how much you care about your children, how you're trying to understand what's going on, and I think maybe you're exactly what this family needs right now." Beth looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hudson stood up. "I mean, if you really want to help, maybe you should dig deeper. Find out more about what's going on in the company. Maybe you can find a way to fix it." With that, she left, leaving Beth in deep thought. Beth sat on her bed for a long time thinking about everything she had heard. She realized that she had found allies among the staff, people who really cared about the Thornton family and wanted to help. She also realized that her task had become much more difficult and important than she had originally thought. Now she was not just trying to understand her life and become a better mother. Now she was trying to save her family and her business from collapse. Beth stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. She knew she had a long and difficult road ahead of her, but now she had allies, and she was ready to fight for her family, for her business, for her future. "I will not give up," she thought. "I will fix everything, and when I come back, I will be a better wife, a better mother, a better person." With that thought in mind, Beth went to bed, preparing for the new challenges that awaited her tomorrow. 3 weeks have passed since Beth started working as a nanny in her own home. During this time, she not only grew closer to her children, but also found allies among the staff. However, the more she learned about the situation in the family and the company, the more dangerous her situation became. One morning, Beth noticed Richard watching her closely while she was eating breakfast. His gaze was cold and suspicious. "Miss Thompson," he suddenly said to her, "you seem very interested in our family's affairs. Why?" Beth felt her heart quicken. "I just want to do my job the best I can, Mr. Thornton. Understanding family dynamics helps me take better care of the children." Richard didn't look convinced. "Be careful that your curiosity doesn't take you too far." After this conversation, Beth noticed that the atmosphere in the house had changed. Mrs. Hudson, who had previously been favorable to her, suddenly became cold and demanding. "Miss Thompson," she said one day, "I am not happy with your work. The children's rooms are not clean enough. You must redo everything." Beth knew the rooms were perfect, but she silently set to work again. George, the butler, who used to be always ready to help, now avoided her gaze and refused to speak. Lucy, a young maid, whispered to her one day, "Mr. Thornton has ordered us to keep an eye on you. He thinks you are a spy." Beth felt fear grip her. She realized that her situation was becoming more and more dangerous, but she couldn't give up now that she was so close to the truth. One night, as Beth was putting the children to bed, she heard Richard on the phone in his office. "I can't let anyone find out about this," he said quietly. "If information about our offshore accounts gets out, we'll lose everything." Beth held her breath. This was exactly the proof she was looking for. The next day, things got worse. As Beth was driving her children to school, the driver suddenly announced that the car was having problems and she had to walk. This meant a long walk in the rain with two disgruntled children. When they finally got to school, Olivia's teacher pulled Beth aside. "Miss Thompson, we have received a complaint from Mr. Thornton. He says you are not helping Olivia with her homework properly." Beth was shocked. She had spent hours helping Olivia with her homework. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "I always—" But the teacher interrupted her. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." When she returned home, Beth found her room had been turned upside down. Her personal belongings were scattered and the photo of Emma she had kept in a hiding place was gone. She knew it was a warning. Richard was letting her know that he could make her life unbearable. But Beth was not going to give up. She continued to gather information, writing down everything she heard and saw. She knew she was taking a risk, but she also realized that this might be her only chance to save her family and company. One night, after everyone was asleep, Beth snuck into Richard's office. She knew it was dangerous, but she had to find proof of his fraud. She was cautiously looking through the documents on his desk when she suddenly heard footsteps in the hallway. Beth quickly hid behind the curtain, holding her breath. The door opened and Richard entered. He sat down at his desk and began to look through the same documents Beth had just been looking at. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. "How could I have let things get to this point?" Beth felt her heart clench with pain. Despite everything that had happened, she still loved this man. Suddenly, Richard raised his head and looked directly at the curtain behind which Beth was hiding. "Who's there?" he asked sharply. "Come out at once." Beth knew it was the end, but instead of fear, she felt strangely relieved. It was time for the truth to come out. She slowly stepped out from behind the curtain, looking directly into her husband's eyes. "Hi, Richard. I think we need to talk." Beth stood in front of Richard, feeling her heart beating at a frantic pace. She saw his eyes widen in shock and then narrow in anger. "Elizabeth?" he whispered, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. What does this mean?" Beth took a deep breath, preparing for the conversation that would change their lives forever. "Yes, Richard, it's me, and I know about everything, about the company, about the debts, about your affair. I've been here for 3 weeks watching everything that happens in our house." Richard stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You've been spying on me? My own family? How could you?" "How could you?" Beth replied, her voice icy. "How could you risk everything we've built together? How could you cheat on me?" Richard tried to walk toward her, but Beth held up her hand to stop him. "No, Richard. I don't want to hear your excuses. I've seen enough, and I've made my decision." She walked to the office door and opened it. "I want you to leave. I want you to leave now. Pack your things and leave this house." Richard looked stunned. "You can't just kick me out. This is my house." Beth shook her head. "No, Richard. This is our home and our company, and I'm not going to let you ruin it. You need to leave. Now." Richard stared at her for a moment longer, then slumped his shoulders and slowly walked out of the office. Beth heard him walk up the stairs to his bedroom to gather his things. She took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pulsing through her veins. This was just the beginning. Beth quickly went down to the kitchen where all the staff had gathered for a morning meeting. "Good morning, everyone," she said as she walked in. Everyone turned to her in surprise. "I have an important announcement to make." She took off her wig and wiped off her makeup. There were surprised exclamations in the room. "I am Elizabeth Thornton," she said firmly, "and from this moment on, I am taking over this house and our company." She told them about the situation with the company, about Richard's betrayal, and about her plan to fix it. She saw the shock on their faces, but also the understanding and willingness to help. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said, "but I need your help. Together we can fix this." Marta, the old cook, was the first to step forward. "We are with you, Mrs. Thornton. How can we help?" One by one, the rest of the staff expressed their support. Beth felt her heart fill with gratitude and determination. "Thank you," she said. "Now let's get to work. We have a lot to do." Over the next few hours, Beth worked tirelessly. She contacted the company's lawyers, demanding a full audit of all finances. She held phone calls with key investors, assuring them that the situation was under control. When Richard came downstairs with his suitcases, Beth met him in the lobby. "Here are the documents," she said, handing him a folder. "This is a temporary agreement on the division of property and management of the company. Sign them." Richard looked defeated. "Elizabeth, please, let's talk about this." But Beth was adamant. "Sign them, Richard, or the next conversation we have will be with my lawyers." With a sigh, Richard signed the documents and left. Beth watched him get into a taxi and drive away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. But she had no time for emotions. She went back to work. The next challenge was the children. Olivia and Max were confused by the disappearance of their father and the sudden appearance of their mother. "Mom?" Olivia asked when Beth entered the children's room. "Is it really you? Where's Beth?" Beth sat down on the bed next to the children. "Yes, sweetie. It's me. Beth. It was me. I was pretending to be closer to you." "But why?" Max asked, looking confused. Beth sighed. "Because I realized that I had forgotten the most important thing. You. I wanted to understand what was going on in our family and be a better mom to you." She hugged the children. "I know that everything seems strange and scary now, but I promise you that everything will be different now. I will be there for you. Always." The children clung to her, and Beth felt her heart fill with love and determination. She knew there were many challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them head on. Over the next few days, Beth worked almost around the clock. She conducted a full audit of the company, uncovering all of Richard's financial fraud. She negotiated with banks to restructure debts. She was looking for new investors, presenting them with a plan to restore the company. But most importantly, she found time for her children. She helped them with their homework, read them stories at bedtime, and played with them on weekends. She finally became the mother she always wanted to be. The staff became her reliable support. They helped with the children when she was busy with work. They supported her when she felt her strength was running out. A week later, the first good news came. They managed to find a new investor willing to invest in the company. The banks agreed to restructure the debts. Beth gathered all the staff in the living room to share the news. "Friends," she said, "thanks to your support and hard work, we were able to save the company from bankruptcy. But this is only the beginning. We still have a lot of work to do." She looked at each of them. "I want you to know that you are not just employees. You are part of our family, and I promise that from now on, things will be different. We will work together, respect each other, and support each other." There was applause in the room. Beth felt her eyes fill with tears of gratitude. That evening, after putting her children to bed, Beth sat in her office reviewing the financial reports. She felt tired, but also deeply satisfied. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was Martha with a cup of tea. "I thought you might like some, Mrs. Thornton," she said, placing the cup on the table. Beth smiled. "Thank you, Martha. And please, call me Elizabeth." Martha nodded. "You know, Elizabeth, I've been working in this house for many years, and I have never seen you so alive, so real." Beth thought for a moment. "You know, Martha, I think I've finally found me, the real me." After Martha left, Beth went to the window and looked out at the city at night. She knew there were still many challenges ahead. She would have to fight for her company, raise her children on her own, and maybe even go through a painful divorce. But she also knew that she was stronger than ever. She knew who she was and what she wanted, and she was ready to fight for it. "This is a new beginning," she whispered to herself. "And this time, I'm going to do it right." With that thought, Beth returned to her desk, ready to face the new day and the new challenges it would bring. She knew the road would not be easy, but she was ready to walk it, for herself, for her children, for all the people who believed in her. 2 months have passed since Elizabeth Thornton revealed her true identity and took control of her life and business. These months have been filled with hard work, sleepless nights, and constant challenges, but Elizabeth felt like she was finally moving in the right direction. This morning she woke up earlier than usual. Today was a big day, the day she was going to present the company's new strategy to the board of directors and key investors. Elizabeth knew that the future of not only her business, but also of all the people who worked for her depended on this presentation. She quietly went down to the kitchen, trying not to wake the children. Marta was already there preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Elizabeth," the cook greeted her. "You're early today. Are you nervous for the big day?" Elizabeth smiled. "A little, but I'm ready. We've all worked so hard for this." Martha put a cup of coffee in front of her. "You'll do fine. You've changed in these 2 months. You've grown stronger." Elizabeth thanked her and began to look over her notes. She knew every number and fact by heart, but she still wanted to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything. Suddenly she heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Olivia and Max, who had come to have breakfast before school. "Mom!" Max exclaimed, running up to her. "You promised we'd watch a movie together tonight." Elizabeth hugged her son. "Of course, dear. I didn't forget. As soon as I get home from work, we'll have a family movie night." Olivia came over and sat down next to her. "Mom, are you sure you can get back on time? You know how important this meeting is." Elizabeth looked at her daughter with pride. Over the past 2 months, Olivia had become much more attentive and understanding. "I promise I'll be on time," Elizabeth said. "This meeting is really important, but you are the most important thing in my life, and I will never forget that again." After breakfast, Elizabeth said goodbye to her children and headed to the office. On the way, she received a message from her lawyer. Richard had finally agreed to the terms of the divorce. It was another victory, but Elizabeth felt a little sad. Despite everything that had happened, part of her still loved the man she had lived with for so many years. She was met at the office by Lucy, who now worked as her personal assistant. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornton. Everyone is already in the conference room. They are waiting for you." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Thank you, Lucy. Well, it's time to get started." She walked into the conference room, feeling the eyes of everyone there. They included members of the board of directors, key investors, and this was a surprise, Richard. Elizabeth froze for a moment, but then pulled herself together and began her presentation. She talked about the company's new strategy, plans to enter new markets, and the innovations they plan to implement. She spoke honestly about the mistakes of the past and how they plan to fix them. "We've been through some tough times," she said in the end, "but these trials have made us stronger. Now we know our weaknesses and are ready to overcome them. We have a clear plan and a team ready to implement it. I ask you to believe in us once again." After her speech, the room fell silent. Then one of the investors stood up. "Mrs. Thornton, I was skeptical when I heard about the changes in the company's leadership. But now I see that you have a clear vision for the future. I am ready to support your plan." Other investors and board members began to express their support. Elizabeth felt a huge weight lift off her shoulders. Suddenly, Richard stood up. "Elizabeth," he said, and everyone in the room fell silent. "I want to say that I was wrong. You have proven that you are capable of running this company better than I am. I support your plan and am ready to help you if you want me to." Elizabeth was surprised by this admission. She nodded to Richard. "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your support." After the meeting, when everyone had left, Richard approached Elizabeth. "Can I talk to you alone?" They went out into the hallway. Richard looked tired and aged. "Elizabeth," he began, "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know that it's too late to fix anything, but I want you to know that I am proud of you. What you've done in these 2 months. It's incredible." Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears. "Thank you, Richard. It means a lot to me. I signed the divorce papers," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'll always be here for you if you or the kids need anything." Elizabeth nodded. "I appreciate that, Richard, and I hope we can stay friends, for the sake of the children." They said goodbye, and Elizabeth felt strangely relieved. This conversation put an end to their relationship, but opened up the possibility of a new beginning. When Elizabeth returned home, she found her children eagerly waiting for her. "Mom, you made it!" exclaimed Max, throwing himself into her arms. "Of course, dear," Elizabeth smiled. "I promised." They all settled down on the couch together to watch the movie. Olivia leaned against her mother. "How was the meeting, Mom?" Elizabeth hugged her daughter. "Very well, dear. But you know what? It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is us, our family." Later that night, when the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat in her office looking through photos on her phone. She paused at a photo she had taken a few years ago of her, Richard, and the children, all smiling and happy. She felt a little sad for what had been lost. But then she looked at a new photo she had taken tonight, she and the kids on the couch all laughing at some joke in a movie. Elizabeth smiled. Life had changed, but she finally felt like she was moving in the right direction. She knew who she was and what she wanted. She was ready for new challenges and new victories. A year has passed since Elizabeth Thornton discovered her true identity and took control of her life and business. During this time, many changes have taken place, both in her personal life and in the company. This morning, Elizabeth woke up with a sense of anticipation. Today was the day of the annual shareholders' meeting, where she would present the company's performance over the past year. She knew it would be a challenging day, but she was ready for it. She went down to the kitchen to find Marta preparing breakfast and her children, Olivia and Max, already sitting at the table. "Good morning, Mom," Max exclaimed, running up to her for a hug. Elizabeth hugged her son and kissed Olivia on the forehead. "Good morning, my darlings. How did you sleep?" "Good," Olivia replied, but Elizabeth noticed that her daughter looked a little worried. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting down next to her. Olivia sighed. "It's just, today is a big day for you, right? What if something goes wrong?" Elizabeth smiled and took her daughter's hand. "Olivia, listen to me. No matter what happens at the meeting today, the most important thing is us, our family. We've been through a lot together and it's made us stronger. No matter what happens, we will get through it together." Olivia nodded and a slight smile appeared on her face. After breakfast, Elizabeth went to the office. On the way, she received a message from Lucy. "Everything is ready for the meeting. Richard just arrived and wants to talk to you before we start." Elizabeth felt a little nervous. Although she and Richard had remained on friendly terms for the sake of the children, their business meetings were still a bit tense. The shareholder meeting went better than Elizabeth could have hoped. She presented impressive results. The company's profits had grown by 30% over the previous year, new business lines had been opened, and the company's reputation had improved significantly. When she finished her presentation, the room fell silent. Then one of the largest shareholders stood up. "Mrs. Thornton, I have to say that a year ago I doubted your ability to run this company, but you have proven me wrong. What you've done this year has been incredible." The other shareholders began to applaud, and Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears of pride and relief. After the meeting, Richard approached her. "Congratulations, Elizabeth, you deserve it." She smiled. "Thank you, Richard, and thank you for your support. It means a lot to me." When Elizabeth returned home, she found her children eagerly waiting for her. "How was it, Mom?" Olivia asked. Elizabeth hugged the children. "Very well, darlings. But you know what? The best part of the day was coming home to you." Later that evening, when the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat in her office looking through photos from the past year. She could see how she had changed, not only externally but also internally. She had become stronger, more confident, more open to life. Suddenly, she heard a knock at the door. It was Marta with a cup of tea. "I thought you could use it, Elizabeth," she said, putting the cup on the table. Elizabeth smiled. "Thank you, Martha. You know, I often think about the day you first saw me as Beth Thompson. Did you realize it was me?" Martha laughed. "Oh dear, I knew from the first day. A mother always recognizes her child even if she's pretending to be someone else." Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears of gratitude. "Martha, you have always been more than just a housekeeper to me. You were my second mother. Thank you for everything." They embraced, and Elizabeth felt the last vestiges of the tension of the past year leave her. After Martha left, Elizabeth went to the window and looked out at the city at night. She thought about everything she had gone through this year, the pain of betrayal, the fear of losing everything, the hard struggle to rebuild the company, and finally, the triumph of victory. But most importantly, she thought about the lessons she had learned, the importance of honesty, the power of forgiveness, the value of family and true friends. "It was a difficult year," she whispered to herself, "but I am grateful for every moment of it, because every challenge made me stronger, every victory made me wiser." With these thoughts in mind, Elizabeth returned to her desk and began taking notes for a new project. She knew there were still many challenges ahead, but now she was ready for them. Because now she knew her true strength. The strength of a woman who had been betrayed and emerged victorious. The strength of a mother fighting for a better future for her children. The strength of a leader leading her team to new heights. Elizabeth Thornton was no longer just a millionaire. She was a woman who had found her way, her strength, and her true value. And that was much more important than any money or titles. With a smile on her face, she continued to work, ready for new adventures and new victories that lay ahead.